Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we're going to take a look at this thing right here, which is the Dell EMC S5296F-ON. And what this is this is a 96 port 25 gig Ethernet switch, and it also has 8 100 gig Ethernet ports. The ON means that it's designed for open networking, and we're going to cover all of this stuff and tear this thing apart in this video. And yeah, I'm not gonna hold that thing the entire time because it's just too big and heavy, but we have B-roll and photos, so we're gonna just use that. Now, something that you will have definitely noticed with that switch is the fact that it's a little bit different than some of the other switches that we've looked at. We've recently looked at the Dell EMC Networking S5196F-ON, which is kind of like the previous generation 48 port 25 gig Ethernet, and it also has some 100 gig Ethernet ports as well, but it's really previous generation. And then we also looked at the S5296F-ON, which is the same generation, but it has 32 100 gigabit Ethernet ports and actually 2 SP Plus ports as well. We'll link those videos in the description. But something that I really wanted to do was just kind of go through the switch, tell you why I had a hypothesis that it was going to be way more amazing than it actually was. But really the reason that we got this switch right here is because it's part of a broader project. And so as part of that, we are looking at a couple different switch options. And I just kind of wanted to show you the inside of these switches since really it's pretty hard to find a lot of this information. And so in this video, the plan is that we're basically going to go take a look at the hardware of this switch. We're going to talk a little bit about the open networking and software side, do a little bit of comparison between this and some of the other switches that we've looked at, and then finally just kind of give some final thoughts. And so something that you just kind of need to understand in terms of why we even have this switch is that, and why I even had the idea for doing this switch, is that we're doing this massive fiber project on the STH main site. Rohit is actually going through and we're taking a look at different fiber optic things, putting together guides every single week on the STH main site. So definitely go check that out and just keep checking what we have there because we have a lot of really cool stuff to kind of demystify a lot of the fiber build out. Now in this studio, so this new studio, we actually have now a ton of fiber. And so this is the first video I'm doing with all of this fiber. And I'll give you an example. This is being pulled from the wall over there. So that way we'll have fiber that I can actually have in a rack, pull out on set if we need to. But this is 240 fibers. We're using both single mode, which is in the black tube, as well as multi-mode, which is over here. And we just have little extra covers on them, just because I'm so worried about dust. But the overall studio is gonna have something like, I think we have already 312 fibers already brought into the studio, and we're building out a total, I think, of around 1,700 fibers. And one of the big reasons for that is, number one, I just want to show people all this fiber stuff, but two, in a place like this where we have a lot of server storage and networking gear, coming and putting like a 100 gig Ethernet switch or a 400 gig Ethernet switch in the next generation on set would just be too loud. You just wouldn't be able to hear me. A lot of people would actually say that's a benefit, but for the purpose of making videos, it would be a little bit challenging. And so the idea is that we're just pulling a ton of fiber, so that way we can arbitrarily hook up basically any kind of gear that we want and have everything go back to central switches. And that is why we were looking at the S5296F-ON, because there are a total of over 100 ports. I mean, there's a total of 104 ports, but you can break out the 100 gig Ethernet ports. And so that gives you actually a lot of fiber that you can go bring back to a central switch. And price-wise, getting them on the secondhand market these days, they're actually not that expensive. You can get them for under $3,000, no problem. And so, it seemed like maybe that would be something that, although it seems like a lot of money to have a $3,000 switch, on the flip side, if you had to have switches in every room that had 100 or 25 gig Ethernet, it would be, way more expensive. And so really the idea was maybe this would be the aggregation switch. And one of the key features for that was the fact that it was in 2U. And my thought was, well, if you have bigger fans and you have more room for heatsink, well, Dell could make a quieter switch than the S5232F-ON that we just looked at, which is a 1U, switch, but basically use the same Broadcom switch chip. That was a good hypothesis. It didn't necessarily work out like that, and we're going to talk about why later in this video. But first, let's get to the hardware overview. So let's start with the left hand of the chassis, which is kind of what we've been doing. And what you're going to see there is some features that are really standard that we've seen on other versions, the 5100 series, 5200 series. We've certainly seen this configuration a couple times now. where we have the Dell, LED lights for all the status lights and stuff like that. Over on the left-hand side, we also have the Dell stacking number LCD. What is different though, is that we actually see a lot of the ports and management interfaces that, we would see typically on the rear of a lot of these Dell switches is actually on the front of the switch this time. Specifically, we have serial ports, we have USB ports, we have an out-of-band Ethernet management port. And so we have all of the things that we saw on the S5148F-ON and also the S5232F-ON. Those were on the back of the switch. And one of my comments was like, if you put that into a rack, in the middle of a rack, in the middle of servers, and sometimes it's really hard to get to, right? And that just that stinks to have to go in and reach into a rack and do that. And that's why I generally prefer getting our switches that we use in the lab and all other places, really to have front IO and have that front management stuff. So that way you just don't have to go around to the back of the rack ever. And so I think it's kind of funny that on the 1U switches, Dell says, we're gonna go through in the back of the switch. But on the 2U switch, it's like, oh yeah, cool. No, we're just gonna actually switch our design language up totally and we're gonna go put it on the front of the switch. We'll show you a little bit why later in this video, but I just kind of thought it was an interesting change. Okay, now next to that, what you're gonna see is a giant array of a total of 96 SFP28 25 gigabit Ethernet ports. Now to a lot of people, this is gonna look like, oh, they basically just took two switches and stuck them together in a single box. That is not what this is at all. This is a single switch ASIC that's running all of these ports. But let's keep talking about the ports and let's get to the right-hand side. We're gonna see a total of 8 QSFP28 ports. Now these are the 100 gigabit Ethernet ports, and some of them can actually be split out so that way they can be 25 gig Ethernet ports as well. Now what you don't see on this switch that we did see on the S5232F-ON using the exact same switch ASIC is we did not see, the two SFP plus ports for management and what have you, so the 10 gig ports on the front of the switch. It just seems like Dell did not put those on this switch, but they did put it on the 100 gig switch. You can actually break out all of the 100 gig ports to 4 25 gig Ethernet ports and get a total of 128 25 gig Ethernet ports on the switch if you wanted to. Now there are a lot of reasons why you would not want to do that, but you could. And since I mentioned it, let's just do the back of the switch real quick. What you're gonna see is that you have 4 large fan modules. Now these fans are actually 80 millimeter fan units. So they're actually a little bit bigger than we saw on the S5232 in this much larger switch. It makes sense because you have a 2U chassis, so you can use larger fans. And you're gonna see that they're on these nice little hot swap caddies. So you can see like right over here, we actually have the little hot swap connector. And this little PCB actually has basically 4 pins to control the fan. Plus you also have 2 pins, which controls the LED that makes this handle light up and say like green, this fan is working perfectly. So we have those 4 fan modules, but we also have more fans on the rear because we have these Dell 1.1 kilowatt 80 plus platinum power supplies. One thing to note that's a little different with servers versus these switches is the fact that you do have directional airflow. This is set up from power supply to port airflow. So you're gonna see that we have a little blue sticker here, and that little blue sticker tells us that that's the configuration. If we saw a red sticker going the other way, that would mean that the airflow is going the opposite direction. Again, one of the things that is a little bit interesting just on this switch is that even though we're using the same switch ASIC, and in theory we have the same amount of total switching throughput in this switch as we had on the 3200 gig switch, what we actually get is a much larger power supply. The power supply on the 32100 gig version of the switch was, I think, 750 watts, but this is a 1.1 kilowatt unit, and we have redundant units, so that way you can have A and B power. And if you just kind of take a step back and look at the total rear again, you're gonna notice that basically the entire rear of this chassis is one of 2 things. It's either fan or it's power supply. So there is no room to basically go and put your management Ethernet port or your serial port or your USB port and stuff like that. So Dell did have to move it to the front of the chassis. But at the same time, if you are gonna have a switch that has to have it on the front of the chassis and you have other switches with extra faceplate space, like wouldn't it be better just to have your entire line have all that IO in the front? Come on, Dell, like make that happen. All right, and so let's get inside the chassis, and we're just gonna look at a couple things real quick before we get to kind of the main bit. And the specific one that I wanna look at is just the fact that this actually has something that is a lot different than on some of the other switches that we've looked at. This particular version has some airflow channel that goes from the redundant power supplies. And then from the redundant power supplies, it channels air all the way to just a little sliver of the front of the chassis. And what that practically means is that the fans that are at the rear of this chassis, because of that metal airflow guide, are the ones that are cooling the switch ASIC and all the SFPs, the management controllers, all that kind of stuff. They're not actually, kind of wasted, I guess, or the power supply fans are also not cooling any of those components as well. So just something to kind of keep in mind. When we look at higher end switches, such as the Innovium 32 port 400 gig Ethernet switch, which is, much higher end, like 4 times the speed of this thing, that is something where you do see a lot more attention paid to airflow. Because when you get to a real high performance switch, this is kind of more of like a mid-range switch these days. When you get to the higher performance switches, you do definitely see a lot more attention paid to airflow than we see here. Okay, so let's get to the heart of this, and let's specifically start on the front of the chassis. Something that you're gonna just notice real quick is that you have this kind of giant heatsink block that actually covers the SFP plus ports in the front. The cages kind of go back into the chassis, and so we have this very long metal heatsink that's there. On the 32 port version, we saw more of each individual SFP cage had its own little heatsink. This is something that's a little bit different at a chassis level. And then behind that, what we have is the Broadcom Trident 3, and this is actually an X7. Now, just as a quick refresher, Tomahawk is really kind of Broadcom's really high-end, just all-out performance switch chip, whereas the Trident is kind of more of the line that's designed with more enterprise-like features. And so that's kind of how Broadcom kind of bifurcates. They have some other products too, but that's basically the big bifurcation in the industry. And since this is the X7, which is really kind of the higher end switch of this line, of this generation, with this switch chip, what you're going to see is the fact that we get a total of, usually these switch chips are going to run switches that have a aggregate port count of, you're going to count something like 3.2 terabits per second. So that's our 96 25 gig Ethernet ports plus our 800 gig Ethernet ports, and that's kind of how we get there. That also means that in full duplex mode, we get a total of 6.4 terabits per second. There are some other changes just to this main switch PCB, other than the fact that the port configuration is way different. The actual heatsink that is on that ASIC is definitely taller than we saw on the 1U switch, but at the same time, it's also, it looks like the fin density is just not as high, and so it's kind of just a little bit different. And then around that, what you're actually going to see is that we still have the Lattice FPGA on one side, but we don't necessarily have the same configuration in terms of the rest of the switch. For example, behind the switch chip, we actually have a Xilinx FPGA. Typically, these FPGAs are used for lighting the port status indicators and just functions like that. The other thing is that the microsemi timing chip is actually on a little board, kind of like we've seen in other switches, but it's actually now behind the main switch chip and it's kind of off to the side. That, I think, is because of that airflow channel that came from the power supplies. They didn't have enough room to go and put it on the side like they normally would, so it ended up kind of off to the side over here. Now, what we have behind that is actually a different board that has a lot of the features, like, for example, it does the, redundant or the hot swap fans. It also, is our power supply input, all that kind of stuff is there. And we also, some of the other big features, we also get the management controller and we get the second management controller, and those are definitely big deals as well. Like we saw on the S5296F-ON, we actually get a 64 gigabyte SSD. And not only do we get that 64 gig SSD, which is about 4 times bigger than the previous generation, but we also get 16 gigs of ECC SODIMM memory. Now, you're only gonna see one DIMM on the top, and that's an 8 gig DIMM. So you might say well, hey, what's going on here? Why is it only one 8 gig DIMM? And the reason for that is that there is another 8 gig DIMM on the bottom of the board. We went into this a little bit more on the previous video, but one of the big reasons that this is a big deal that it's Denverton versus the Atom C2000 series is that it actually has, in terms of a management processor, like a 4 or 5 year newer processor, which is kind of a big deal actually. You get a lot more features and it's just a much better platform. It also is not subject or potentially subject to the AVR54 bug, or at least the same one that we saw on the Atom C2000 series. So just by not being associated with that, and I think a lot of network administrators had a really bad time with the Atom C2000 series. And so having the Atom C3000 series, I think actually helps a little bit for resale, along with the fact that this is a Broadcom switch chip. And then not only do we have the Denverton-based, management controller that really runs like, your software is really going to run on there. And that's going to be like your management control plane for the main switch. But then also you now have a ASPEED board. That little ASPEED board is, the ASPEED controller is actually a baseboard management controller. ASPEED makes most of the world's BMCs. It's only a few companies that really make their own. Like, for example, Dell has iDRAC, HPE has ILO, and then, you have Lenovo with their IMM solution, or xClarity. But the vast majority of everybody else uses these ASPEED BMCs. Well, hyperscalers use it, like Facebook puts these things everywhere. I mean, the ASPEEDs are just kind of like industry standard, except for the kind of legacy players make their own. So it's actually kind of cool that this switch doesn't use iDRAC. It uses a more industry standard solution. And honestly, I wish Dell did more of that instead of kind of building these walled gardens with PowerEdge. Now, iDRAC is very nice, but in a switch like this, it is nice the fact that you're seeing Dell say, yep, we're going to do the open networking thing and really kind of have more of an industry standard BMC versus something that's proprietary. One other thing that we did point out in the S5198F-ON video that we should probably point out here as well is just the fact that the CR2032 battery has now migrated. And because we have stacked power supplies, we can actually put that, battery in kind of its own little spot. It's no longer under the other boards that are in this chassis. So it's really easy to go manage or go swap out if you ever needed to go swap it. It'd take, be relatively fast to go do that. And I say relatively fast because this thing has like over a dozen screws just to get the lid off. And it actually stays on pretty securely even without the screws there. So, I mean, like, I don't know why, but this is like one of the kind of worst chassis to actually get into of what we're seeing on modern switches. Now, something that was really kind of hard to get, and just lighting this whole thing, it was just total pain, but I'm just going to describe it to you, is that the top switch PCB basically has the 100 gig ports, and it also has the top set of, two 25 gig Ethernet ports on it. But then there's another board that actually sits below kind of the switch chip and those ports, and that actually provides connectivity for the other 25 gig Ethernet ports, or the other 48 25 gig Ethernet ports that are sitting at the bottom of the switch. So this board, or this actually switch, has a lot more going on inside of it than we saw on like the 1U switches. All right, so let's talk about open networking and management. Now, our switch is set up with Dell OS 10 because that's kind of what we're using right now. At some point, we are going to probably switch this over to Sonic. And one of the really cool things is that this is on the Sonic hardware compatibility list, so you can totally just go do that. That was one of the big changes when Dell went from the S5100 series, which is the Cavium, now Marvell X-Pliant series, and they moved to Broadcom with the S5200 series. You actually get to use things like Sonic, which is just absolutely awesome. One of the reasons that these S5200 series switches are quite a bit more actually than the S5100 series, and the S5100 series is actually less expensive than the S5000 series, is really because of that X-Pliant chip. I don't think supports a lot of the more open networking bits, and so because of that, you're actually seeing the resale values of those fall like quite a bit below what you're seeing the Broadcom parts sell for. When we switch to the Cumulus Linux, which is now NVIDIA hardware compatibility list, we can see that the S5296F-ON is on there as well. Now, NVIDIA is really focusing, it looks like they're focusing Cumulus more on their Spectrum, so their Mellanox Spectrum switches going forward. So that's kind of a bummer, but at the end of the day, if you are gonna do open networking, the vast majority of folks that do that are gonna be doing it on the Sonic platform rather than the Cumulus platform, because that's the big ecosystem. So overall, keeping this section a little bit shorter than we did last time, the big benefit here, again, is just the fact that because we have that Broadcom Trident 3 chipset, we have the Intel Denverton or Atom C3000 series CPU, we have something that is very kind of industry standard. And because it's very industry standard, it also means that in terms of thinking about open networking and being able to put a non-Dell specific networking operating system on here, well, that's definitely something that you can do on this platform because you are kind of using a more industry standard type of box. Okay, so let's get to power and cooling here for a second. So one of the big reasons that I purchased this switch, and normally, we get these 1U 32 port 100 gig Ethernet switches, and this is what we use in the lab all the time. Even for 25 gig Ethernet, we're really breaking out those 100 gig ports to 25 gig in racks, and we just have switches in every rack. And so it makes life just super easy to just kind of manage it like that. But for this project where we're going to go and run almost 1,700 fibers and 10 kilometers of fiber, we had to kind of rethink that strategy. And the thought was, well, if we got a 2U system, well, maybe that would be better in terms of noise because you can use larger fans, and maybe that would make it quieter. And the hope would be that power consumption in our use case wouldn't actually be so bad because we'll use some DACs and all that kind of stuff. So maybe it would be okay. So first off, the power consumption Dell rates at a typical of 457 watts, with the maximum power consumption on the switch at 893 or 897 watts. Just look, 893. And the key thing there is that it does definitely require the fact that Dell would go up from the 750 watt up to the 1.1 kilowatt platinum power supplies. The typical power consumption is about 100 watts higher on this switch versus the 32 ports 100 gig switch. So it actually is notably higher. And also at the higher end, when you start talking about maximum power consumption, it's actually something like 250, 260 watts higher than that 32 port switch. And by the way, that means that both chassis are actually running the exact same switch chip. They're using the same management controller. all that kind of stuff, and yet you do have higher power consumption. And the reason for that is really just the fact that this is a 96 port SFP28 switch, plus you have the 800 gig ports. So while the 100 gig ports would largely be the same depending on whatever optics or whatever you put in there, the fact of the matter is that you can put, instead of having 24 QSFP28 optics that you could put in there, you actually could put up to, I guess, a total of 96 SFP28 optics in this switch, which just means that, your just sheer number of optics that you can have goes up. And even though the SFP28 optics tend to be lower power in most cases than the QSFP28 optics, at the end of the day, you end up still, you could have a lot more. Right? And if you have more of them, you lose a little bit of efficiency. And then that, when you multiply that by having, like 96 ports, that means that you basically end up at the place where this uses a lot more power. Idle power consumption was actually pretty darn close between our two switches. So that was something that I guess really kind of leads me to kind of believe that that's why Dell is rating this, right? Because, if idle is pretty much the same with the same chips and all that kind of stuff in there, but then as you start to fill it, depending on what kind of optics and DACs and stuff like that you put in the switch, you start seeing that those derivations happen. I think that's really what's going on here. But still, my theory did not hold true. And that was the idea that, the 1U switch was really about 360 watts per U, whereas the 2U, and this is typical, right? The 2U switch was about 230 watts per U. And so the idea was, well, if you have bigger fans that are usually quieter and you don't necessarily you don't have the same heat density, well, that should mean that you end up having a quieter switch, right? And the answer to that was actually no. And so what I did was I actually just went and I hooked them both up behind me. And I just said, okay, well, let's see if one's like way louder than the other. And that was definitely not the case. And then I said, okay, well, let me go and just take out a sound meter and just kind of say, just do a quick and dirty, just side-by-side comparison to see if they actually are closer, if they're not really that close. And what we actually found was that the 32 port switch was actually only at about 40 decibels idle, whereas we saw about 41 and change, or about 41, say, on the 96 port 2U switch. So my hypothesis that this chassis that was 2U was going to be like way quieter than the 1U, frankly, that just didn't happen. And I'm totally bummed about it. But there is something that is also a little bit of a bummer here. And that's just the fact that the bottom of this chassis has just this giant airflow area. And so I think that the kind of bummer is that, if Dell really wanted to, you could imagine a world where they go and put a better heatsink on that bottom portion and maybe are able to lower the fan curve a little bit and get a little bit, quieter, especially when you get to things like edge locations, kind of like this would be. You kind of see that as a nice to have where you have less sound or less noise being generated by the switch. I still want to load up all of these switches with, long range optics because we have a ton of single mode fiber now. So I just kind of want to see, if we go put those kind of higher power optics in there, maybe not the highest, but still, pretty decent power optics, what would happen? Just frankly, we don't have 96 long range SFP28 optics to be able to put in this right now. So we're using DACs and short range optics and all kinds of stuff. And that's just kind of where we're at. But hopefully in the not too distant future, we're actually going to get a nice package and that's going to have all of the optics that we need for these. And so I just want to end this with a final thought and almost like a plea to Dell. Please start putting out what your switches are based on. Say that this is a Broadcom Trident 3. If you're going to design it into your switch, be proud of it and go put it out so anybody can go find out that this is a Broadcom Trident 3 switch. Some people won't care. If they do care, well, they're going to want to know anyway. And so if you're going to have an open networking switch, why not just go put it out, put it on the data sheet? The same thing with the management processor. Why don't you say that you have an Atom C3000 series? If you look at the Atom C2000 series and what happened with the AVR54 bug, it would actually be a big deal to be able to easily find out what kind of processor that you have in your switch. So that way like, hey, am I going to have to go plan some downtime to go and pull this out for a swap at some point in the future? If you really want to be an open networking company, you need to go start putting that. And if you just go search for these terms like Broadcom or Intel, Atom, all those things, and you go put those onto the just standard S5200 series datasheet, you don't see them. So if you can't search the datasheet for the primary chips that are in the switches, then that just kind of doesn't feel like a open networking switch, right? Plus, anybody that gets one of these switches is going to figure it out real fast once you let them log in. So why hide it? Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this look at the Dell S5296F-ON. This was definitely a really cool switch, and it's a 2U switch, which a lot of people don't even look at because they just kind of are higher end switches than some of the 48 port 1U switches. So they're a little bit different, but I actually think that it's a pretty interesting thing just to get to open it up and look what's inside. As I mentioned earlier, we are running a giant project to go look at fiber, and we're putting a ton of fiber in just to be able to go show all kinds of really cool networking things. And so definitely check out the STH main site, keep subscribing to the STH YouTube channel so that way you can see whenever we come out with that kind of content. But Rohit is doing an entire series on the STH main site. And if you did like this video, why don't you give us a like, click subscribe, turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.